Censorship and spy thrillers go hand in hand. After all, what better way to stir fear than a story that feels just a little too close to reality? During the Cold War, filmmakers often walked a razor's edge, give audiences a taste of intrigue, but not so much that governments panicked. So, what got cut and why? Some of the edits are almost stranger than the films themselves. Let's uncover the reels they didn't want you to see. The Manchurian Candidate, 1962. Few spy thrillers dared to poke the Cold War bare, like The Manchurian Candidate. Directed by John Frankenheimer, this film dropped audiences into a psychological maze of brainwashing, betrayal, and political manipulation. Frank Sinatra led the cast, but it wasn't just Hollywood star power that made the movie dangerous. It was the story itself. A decorated soldier, unknowingly turned into a pawn, is programmed to follow sinister orders without question. That chilling premise felt ripped from the era's darkest headlines. Here's the twist. After its release in 1962, the movie barely got to breathe. Following the assassination of President John F. Kennedy the next year, the film hit too close to home. The sequence involving a political figure being targeted by a conditioned assassin suddenly felt less like fiction and more like a grim reflection of real-world events. Distributors quietly shelved it, and some television broadcasts later trimmed down its more intense brainwashing montages. The notion of hypnotic control over American soldiers was simply too unsettling for a nation still in mourning. But here's the kicker. The very censorship that buried the movie only added to its legend. When it resurfaced years later, audiences devoured it with fresh eyes, praising its daring critique of Cold War paranoia. That forbidden aura only amplified its impact, turning it into one of the most iconic spy thrillers of the century. Sometimes, trying to hide a film only guarantees it becomes unforgettable. Dr. Strangelove, 1964. Only Stanley Kubrick could turn nuclear paranoia into a dark comedy and get censored for making people laugh too much at it. Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love, the bomb pushed every button of the Cold War mindset. Here was a movie that satirized generals, politicians, and scientists all stumbling toward doomsday with a mix of ego and incompetence. It was outrageous, hilarious, and terrifying all at once. But one scene was too much. The infamous pie fight ending, in which world leaders fling desserts at each other as chaos unfolds, never made it into the final cut. Why? Columbia Pictures executives worried it turned Armageddon into slapstick. More importantly, President Kennedy had just been assassinated, and a line about shooting the president during that food fight felt painfully ill-timed. Kubrick himself pulled the plug, recognizing how sensitive audiences were. The irony is that this cutscene, never shown in full, became the stuff of movie legend. Fans still debate whether its absence made the satire sharper or robbed the film of its ultimate punchline. What survived, though, was powerful enough. Peter Sellers juggling 3 roles, George C., Scott hamming it up as a trigger-happy general, and that haunting final montage of mushroom clouds scored to "We'll Meet Again." By censoring its silliest sequence, Dr. Strangelove became even more biting. Instead of ending with whipped cream pies, it closed with the end of the world, an image that stuck in the collective mind of Cold War audiences. Sometimes, less really is more, especially when the cut material could have shifted the tone from satire to circus. Funeral in Berlin, 1966. Michael Caine's Harry Palmer wasn't James Bond. He wasn't suave, he wasn't glamorous, and he definitely wasn't shooting his way out of exploding layers. Instead, Palmer lived in the gray world of espionage, where double crosses were the only constant. Funeral in Berlin leaned hard into that atmosphere, capturing the fractured reality of life, divided by the infamous wall. But for censors in the East, this movie hit far too close to home. The film centers on Palmer navigating a defector scheme in Berlin, a city split in half by concrete and barbed wire. Scenes were shot with real, looming views of the Berlin Wall, including tense moments where desperate escape attempts were shown. That raw authenticity rattled East German officials. When the film screened in certain Eastern Bloc territories, censors blurred or outright cut any imagery of escape, fearing it would encourage citizens to dream of fleeing westward. The dialogue was also sanitized, erasing sharp criticisms of Soviet control. Ironically, These cuts made the film's espionage puzzle harder to follow in censored regions. Viewers were left with a muddled version, stripped of its most haunting visuals. In the West, though, the uncut release resonated deeply. The realism, the shadows of the wall, the palpable fear of crossing a checkpoint gave audiences a glimpse of what divided Berlin actually felt like. And that's the enduring legacy of Funeral in Berlin. The censorship wasn't just about trimming a film, it was about hiding the truth of a city split in two. By muting those images, censors revealed exactly what they didn't want people to see. That walls don't just divide territory, they divide lives. Torn Curtain, 1966. When Alfred Hitchcock set his sights on Cold War tension, he didn't hold back. Torn Curtain, starring Paul Newman and Julie Andrews, is remembered for its infamous kitchen scene, a sequence that changed the spy thriller forever. Hitchcock wanted to show the brutal reality of taking a life, and so he crafted one of the most agonizingly realistic fights ever put on screen. No quick punches, no dramatic standoffs, just a desperate, drawn-out struggle to silence an enemy agent. Audiences squirmed, but censors squirmed even harder. Several European broadcasts trimmed or shortened the scene, worried it was too instructive. Authorities feared it gave a playbook for violence, showing every grim detail from failed blows to improvised weapons. The realism was groundbreaking, but also unsettling. At a time when spy thrillers often glamorized espionage, Hitchcock forced viewers to see the cost up close. Of course, Hitchcock being Hitchcock, he knew exactly what he was doing. His goal was discomfort. He wanted the audience to feel the weight of the act, not the thrill. But by drawing that line so vividly, he also drew fire from censors, eager to keep their broadcasts clean. Still, the impact was undeniable. That scene became one of the most talked about in Hitchcock's career. Even trimmed, it left viewers rattled. Today, critics see Torn Curtain as a turning point in spy cinema, stripping away the polish and replacing it with raw, physical terror. Sometimes, the most powerful scenes are the ones they tried hardest to erase. The Spy Who Came In from the Cold, 1965. John le Carré's novels never promised glamour. Instead, they delivered bleak portraits of espionage, full of betrayal and moral compromise. The film adaptation of The Spy Who Came In from the Cold, starring Richard Burton, carried that same icy tone. Burton's performance as a weary British agent navigating a deadly East German operation was powerful, raw, and relentlessly cynical, but its honesty sparked controversy. In West Germany, censors took particular issue with a scene suggesting that Western intelligence agencies weren't above manipulation themselves. Lines of dialogue that hinted at the CIA's willingness to sacrifice pawns for a bigger game were muted or trimmed. Why? Because NATO partners weren't eager to distribute a film that portrayed the Western alliance as just as ruthless as their Eastern enemies. For audiences who saw the full version, though, the film hit like a punch. It wasn't Bond, it was the anti-Bond. It pulled back. The curtain on a world where victories were hollow, allies were expendable, and no one walked away clean. Burton's weary glare and gravelly delivery gave the story a weight that censorship couldn't fully erase. Ironically, the very elements censors tried to soften are what made the movie timeless. Its refusal to sugarcoat espionage, its willingness to show both sides playing dirty, gave it a power that outlived the Cold War itself. Even in its censored form, the message came through loud and clear. In the shadowy world of spies, the truth is never simple. Topaz, 1969. Alfred Hitchcock once again stirred political hornets' nests with Topaz, a sprawling Cold War thriller based on real defections and spy scandals. The film followed French intelligence entangled in a web of Soviet infiltration, with a story so daring that it ended up censored even before it hit some theaters. The reason? Hitchcock's script dared to suggest that high-ranking French officials might secretly be working for Moscow. That was dynamite in 1969. In France, the government was having none of it. The original cut included an extended subplot revealing double agents embedded in French political circles. French distributors demanded it be trimmed or removed entirely, fearing a national embarrassment and potential diplomatic uproar. After all, France was still walking a tightrope in NATO politics under Charles de Gaulle, who already had a famously uneasy relationship with the United States. The result was multiple endings and altered edits. In some versions, the traitor's identity was muddled, In others, crucial sequences were shortened or deleted. Critics complained about the uneven pacing, but audiences who got the uncut version understood what Hitchcock had really intended, a bold statement about mistrust within Allied governments. Ironically, the very cuts made to smooth over the controversy damaged the film's reputation. Topaz was dismissed as confusing, with its political bite dulled. Yet today, cinephiles look back on it as one of Hitchcock's most ambitious, if flawed, experiments. Proof that sometimes politics can edit a movie more harshly than any studio executive ever could. The Kremlin Letter, 1970. John Huston's The Kremlin Letter wasn't just another Cold War thriller. It was a bleak, cynical plunge into espionage at its most cutthroat. With a cast including Patrick O'Neill, Max von Sydow, and Orson Welles, the movie dared to depict spycraft as cruel, chaotic, and often pointless. Unlike glamorous spy fantasies, this film showed agents betraying one another with chilling regularity. Unsurprisingly, some of that honesty didn't sit well with international distributors. Certain European releases were edited to downplay references to Soviet labor camps and the bleak realities of life behind the Iron Curtain. Why? Because showing gulags too explicitly risked bans in Eastern Bloc countries. Instead, dialogue was softened, and certain shots were removed entirely. The irony is that this censorship stripped away much of the movie's raw punch. Critics at the time were already divided. Some thought Huston's approach was too cold, too merciless, and too complex for general audiences. Others praised it for its uncompromising look at espionage as a brutal chess game, where every pawn was disposable. The censorship only muddied the waters further, creating versions of the film that felt inconsistent across borders. Over time, though, The Kremlin Letter has been re-evaluated. Its icy tone, once criticized, now feels like a brutally accurate reflection of how espionage operated in the Cold War, not as a glamorous adventure, but as a lonely, often meaningless sacrifice. The censorship may have tried to blunt its edge, but the film's reputation for bleak honesty has only sharpened with age. 3 Days of the Condor, 1975. Sidney Pollack's 3 Days of the Condor gave us Robert Redford as a bookish CIA researcher who stumbles on a Fowler conspiracy and suddenly finds himself hunted. Unlike many spy thrillers, this one wasn't about glamorous gadgets or daring escapes. It was about paranoia, power, and the terrifying reach of intelligence agencies. And that made it dangerous to censors. In the film, Redford's character uncovers a shadowy operation where the CIA plots to manipulate global oil supplies for political gain, for U.S. audiences in the 1970 seconds, in the middle of real fuel shortages. That was already a bold swipe at government secrecy. But for some foreign markets, that swipe was too sharp. Certain television edits in Europe and Latin America snipped dialogue, hinting at Western agencies orchestrating crises. Officials argued it was too inflammatory in a world already rattled by energy disputes. Despite the trims, the film's paranoia resonated. Redford's vulnerable yet determined performance turned him into the perfect everyman, trapped in forces beyond his control. The climax, where his revelations are met with chilling indifference, still sparks debate. Was the film warning us that truth doesn't matter if no one wants to hear it? The censorship didn't erase the message, it amplified it. By trying to dull the criticism, editors only underscored how bold the film's ideas were. 3 Days of the Condor remains one of the definitive paranoid thrillers of the Cold War era, a movie that dared to suggest that sometimes the scariest enemy isn't abroad, it's the one pulling strings at home. Firefox, 1982. Clint Eastwood directing and starring in a high-tech espionage thriller about stealing a Soviet jet? That was always going to stir attention. Firefox told the story of a U.S. pilot smuggled into Moscow to capture a futuristic fighter aircraft with mind-controlled weapons systems. The premise was pure Cold War adrenaline, but not everyone wanted audiences seeing the details. In the Soviet Union, the film was outright banned, which surprised no one. But what's interesting is how the movie was trimmed in certain international television broadcasts. References to the advanced design of the jet and the West's obsession with Soviet technology were downplayed or cut. Why? Authorities worried the film glamorized espionage while humiliating Soviet defenses. censors didn't want local audiences watching a Western fantasy of their prized technology being whisked away under their noses. Even without full Soviet distribution, the film thrived in the West. It played directly into American anxieties about keeping up with Soviet military progress, while feeding the fantasy that one clever pilot could tilt the balance of power. Audiences ate it up, especially since Eastwood's steely charisma gave the story a grounded edge. What's fascinating is that the censorship only fueled its legend. By banning it, Soviet officials practically guaranteed that pirated copies would circulate underground. In a way, the effort to hide it only amplified its mystique. Firefox wasn't just a spy movie, it became a cultural dare, a film whispered about in places it wasn't supposed to exist. Gorki Park, 1983. Based on Martin Cruz Smith's best-selling novel, Gorki Park delivered a murder mystery wrapped inside Cold War intrigue. Starring William Hurt, Lee Marvin, and Joanna Pakula, it explored a Moscow detective uncovering a case that revealed corruption stretching far beyond ordinary crime. But censorship was quick to step in when the film depicted certain realities of life under Soviet control. The most sensitive material? Scenes showing KGB brutality during interrogations and the cold, decaying atmosphere of Moscow's daily life. For European theatrical releases aiming at broader audiences, distributors cut or softened some of those torture sequences, worried about accusations of painting too dark a picture of Soviet institutions. In the Soviet bloc, the movie was banned entirely. What audiences in the West got, however, was still chilling. William Hurt's The portrayal of a weary yet determined investigator humanized a story otherwise dripping in cynicism. The snow-covered streets, the shadows of Gorki Park itself, and the sense of constant surveillance gave the movie an oppressive authenticity. Ironically, the censorship almost backfired. By muting the darkest edges, the film's bleak view of Soviet society became even clearer. The absence of detail only emphasized what censors were trying to hide. Today, Gorki Park remains a rare Western thriller that tried to step inside Moscow's Iron Curtain and got clipped for showing too much truth. Red Dawn, 1984. If any Cold War film screamed controversy from the opening frame, it was Red Dawn. John Milius directed this fever dream of a movie where small-town American teenagers band together after a Soviet invasion. It was part survival story, part patriotic rallying cry, and absolutely loaded with Cold War paranoia. Unsurprisingly, censors didn't let it pass untouched. In the UK, violent sequences involving Soviet troops executing civilians were trimmed for its initial release. The British Board of Film Classification argued the film blurred the line between action fantasy and disturbing imagery that younger viewers could take too seriously. In other countries, distributors toned down its more aggressive rhetoric about resistance, fearing it might be read as an actual call to arms. Despite the cuts, the film struck a nerve. American audiences, still grappling with Cold War fears, turned it into a cultural touchstone. The phrase, "Wolverines," became an anthem for underdog defiance. At the same time, critics blasted it as paranoid propaganda. For Soviet officials, it was nothing less than cinematic provocation, proof that Hollywood was openly fantasizing about teenage militias outsmarting professional armies. The censorship didn't soften its punch. If anything, trimming its most graphic moments only cemented its reputation as one of the most politically charged spy action thrillers of the decade. Love it or hate it, Red Dawn captured Cold War fears in their purest, most exaggerated form, and that's exactly why it was censored. The Fourth Protocol, 1987. By the late 1982s, Cold War thrillers were shifting from paranoia-driven tales to near-apocalyptic what-ifs. The Fourth Protocol, based on Frederick Forsyth's novel, plunged headfirst into that territory. Starring Michael Caine and Pierce Brosnan, it imagined Soviet operatives attempting to smuggle parts of a nuclear device into Britain, aiming to detonate it near a U.S. airbase to fracture NATO. Bold, daring, and a little too detailed for censors' comfort. The sensitive part? Forsyth's book and the film adaptation went into unnerving detail about how such a device could be assembled. While not a blueprint, the explanations were precise enough to make officials uneasy. As a result, certain VHS and television releases trimmed or softened those moments, cutting dialogue that described the mechanics. Authorities didn't want audiences thinking espionage thrillers were doubling as how-to manuals. Even with the edits, the film had teeth. Pierce Brosnan, years before becoming James Bond, turned in a chilling performance as a cold-blooded Soviet agent. His icy demeanor clashed brilliantly with Michael Caine's weary British operative, creating a cat-and-mouse duel that felt rooted in the very real anxiety of the late Cold War years. The cuts didn't dilute the tension, they only added a shadow of mystery, leaving audiences to fill in the blanks about what exactly had been left out. Over time, the censorship itself became part of the film's legacy. Fans speculated endlessly about what had been altered and why, making The Fourth Protocol one of those rare spy thrillers where the missing pieces almost became as famous as the ones that made it to the screen. It proved once again that when governments and studios try to blunt a story, they sometimes sharpen its legend instead. And there you have it, 12 spy thrillers the Cold War tried to muzzle. The irony? Every cut, every trim, every banned screening only made these films more intriguing. They weren't just stories, they were cultural flashpoints, too close to reality for comfort. Which one shocked you the most? Drop your thoughts below, hit like if you enjoyed this deep dive, and subscribe for more untold stories from cinema's shadowy corners. The reels still have secrets left to share.